I'm Harlan Ullman, and it is my good fortune to chair the last panel of today before the drinks party. And I would like to begin my introductory remarks using the wisdom of three philosophers, John Warner, Winston Churchill, and Albert Einstein. Some of you may have known Senator John Warner, who was a very distinguished senator from Virginia, but perhaps his most well-known accomplishment was marrying Elizabeth Taylor when he was a 6th or 7th husband, depending upon how you count Richard Burton. And John would remark later that on his wedding night, he knew what he had to do, but could he make it interesting? And the job of this panel will be to make it interesting, I hope. The events last week are reminiscent of what befell Winston Churchill in July 1945, when he was turned out of office after winning the war. And Clementine turned to Winston, and to try to console him, she said, "Winston, this could be a blessing in disguise." To which Churchill responded, "If it is a blessing, it is indeed in heavy disguise." And I think that what has to be taken from this vast vote is the need to seize on opportunities, because the Army, like the rest of the services here, is going to be squeezed for budgets. I'm afraid the weakening of the EU is going to weaken NATO unless we do something. And of course, what happens as secondary and tertiary consequences in Scotland with Faslane raise other strategic problems. And so the best thing is to say, all right, what can we do? How do we seize this opportunity? And I'm sure General Sir Nick will do that. Regarding Albert Einstein, Einstein said that the solution to a difficult problem should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And I think that applies very much to adaptation. On the one hand, everybody agrees that any organization needs to adapt. On the other hand, it can turn into a slogan or jargon, which makes no sense. This is precisely what befell the term transformation. When George W. Bush assumed the presidency in 2001, he was going to transform the U.S. military for the 21st century. But transforming to what and why were never answered. And we cannot allow the same fate that befell transformation to befall adaptability. We have a very distinguished panel. You have read their biographies. I will introduce them in series, and then they will take no more than 15 minutes. Because one of the things I learned serving in your Navy and my Navy from commanding officers who were harsh and unjust was how to be harsh and unjust. And if you don't agree to my time limits, I will be very harsh and very unjust. Dr. Niall Barr is a lecturer at the Joint Service College. Antony Beevor is a well-known historian of the Second World War. General Michel, Yakovleff, who will not be talking about the original concept, but will be talking about not the need for adaptation, but for mutation. And Dr. General Meir, Finkel, will have very, very interesting things to say about how the Israeli army adopted to the war in Lebanon. So without ado, Dr. Barr, the stage is yours for 15 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I will do my best to stick to the 15 minutes. I find myself in a slightly unusual position. Before Elliot Cohen spoke this morning, I wasn't aware that being a fairly dyed-in-the-wool military historian would make me a necromancer this afternoon, because I'm going to start my talk by conjuring this particular shade from the past. General Edward Braddock, late of the Coldstream Guards. Far more recognized, it has to be said, in the United States than in Britain. Braddock was sent to North America in 1755 with a very clear mission to extirpate the French from the Ohio Valley. And he marched with 2 regular regiments and a volunteer Virginia regiment to do just that. Now, Braddock came from an era in which close order infantry won the day. He didn't fight at the Battle of Fontenoy, but nonetheless, it makes the point. Close order infantry would defeat any opponent, and the British infantry of the day had gained quite a reputation for doing so. But Braddock was going to be operating in very different terrain, the American backwoods, where, in fact, such tactics were not appropriate. And Braddock and his force got within touching distance of Fort Duquesne, their final objective, on the 9th of July 1755, when they were ambushed by French regulars and Indian scouts, amongst others. And Braddock did what he knew best. He formed his infantry into their close order, and they fired into the trees against Indians that sniped back from all directions. Well, after 3 hours of this, and Braddock having 4 horses shot from under him, he was ordering a retreat when he was shot and mortally wounded, and he had to be dragged from the panic and confusion by his Virginian ADC, a rather shocked and dismayed George Washington. Braddock died just a few days later, and his last words, I think, are a clarion call about adaptability and a recognition of the need for change. Who would have thought it? We shall better know how to deal with them another time. Well, of course, Braddock died, and the shocking reality of Braddock's defeat brought serious consequences. As you can imagine, victory being having 1,000 fathers, defeat is always an orphan. Angry colonists blamed the British officers blamed their men, and everyone blamed Braddock. But what happens next is actually not perhaps in quite the mold that we would imagine. The image of Braddock and his expedition that becomes fixed in the American mind is of a brave but arrogant man, of stubbornness and an unwillingness to change. Ironically enough, what happens next, from somebody that you might again see as being an image of stubborn brutality, certainly that's his image in Scotland, comes from the Duke of Cumberland, who recognizes very early on that things need to change. And he writes to Parliament. He's been advised by a Swiss mercenary, a Swiss officer of fortune, that in fact there is another approach, that you can form troops which will contend with the Red Indian in his native forest, but combine their qualities with the discipline required for a regular army. And of course, the 62nd Royal Americans, as they were called, are followed by a number of other regiments which perform extremely well in the French and Indian Wars and indeed in the American War of Independence. Now, I suppose the next part of this tale, before I move on, is actually to mention the way that this becomes enshrined in British military thinking. Various schools are developed, the most famous of which is organized by Coote Manningham, which sees an experimental approach towards rifles, which sees the 60th Royal Americans, now shorn of that title, and the 95th Rifles coming up with tactical procedures, generally inspired by Sir John Moore's system of infantry training, which emphasizes initiative and low-level organization, which leads to an unrivaled spirit of esprit de corps within the British Light Infantry, and which then goes on to shock its opponents, the French, in the Peninsular Wars. Sir Henry Bunbury later stated, the new system of drill and movement which was here introduced by Moore became the model for our infantry and laid the foundations of our superiority in the Peninsular War. So here we have, I hope anyway, a classic example of adaptation in contact. Initial disaster leading to rapid emulation and innovation and effective battlefield tactics. But just as importantly, this is an example of how initial lessons from experience were retained, developed, and then later used as battle-winning techniques in another future conflict. But Braddock's example should also remind us of the fact that adaptation in contact is actually always second best. It's a reaction. And surely the best approach, and it's been hinted at by earlier panels, is to think and experiment, adjust, train and prepare before the conflict begins. Considerations of Napoleon's Grande Armée or the German Wehrmacht, again, which has been mentioned before, make this point. The Germans before the Second World War, or should it be said, a small element of their army, trained, experimented with a vision of future war, which they were then able to enact in the Spanish Civil War, and then test the concept so that when they went into action for real, they were ready, and their opponents were not. Now, when we look at what the Germans do in those early years of the Second World War, those early months, Poland, Belgium, Holland, Norway, and France were given no time to adapt. They were overwhelmed before they could adapt. And I think that's an important aspect. But if I'm going to self-critique just for a moment, of course, the Germans do indeed lose the Second World War. They have a lack of ability to adapt later because they believe they have the winning formula. And the German tactical and operational focus does not change the eventual strategic calculus. But then let's look at some of those British strategic calculi or historical dilemmas and assumptions which we tend to make. Colonel Henderson, one of the great military historians of the 19th century, made this very point, that in fact, throughout the 19th century, the British Army had had to cope with a whole range of different expeditions, all of which were different. And I suppose the wider point here is that the British Army has invariably had to wrestle with these conflicting demands. It's had to shift rapidly from considerations of conventional war to imperial policing or insurgency. And these dilemmas have never really gone away, which suggests that they may well be permanent problems for anyone preparing Britain's armed forces for future combat. But at the same time, the British Army has generally been afforded the luxury, perhaps dubious luxury, of the time and space in which to adapt, due primarily, it has to be said, to the geographical accident of the English Channel and the Royal Navy. And I may be mentioning the blinding glimpse of the obvious here, but when we consider British expeditions in 1793 in Flanders, 1807 Buenos Aires, 1808 Corunna, 1915-16 Gallipoli, 1940 France, 1941 Greece and Crete, and 1942 Singapore, those expeditionary forces or garrisons were bundled unceremoniously from their theatres, but they were able to live, learn, and fight another day. The common thread was the ability of sea power, with the notable exception of Yorktown in 1781 and Singapore in 1942, to rescue, if not rectify, the situation. I think there is part of our warp and weft is that we can lose, but there will always be a second chance. Well, is that a historical assumption which holds true? Another important aspect of this is that Britain has always been able to rely on a major ally or a coalition of allies to take the major burden of the war while Britain gets ready. We've already heard this morning about regeneration, and in some respects it's almost a knee-jerk reaction that we will have time to regenerate. When we consider the succession of European coalitions assembled by British governments during the Napoleonic Wars, the commitment of the French army in the First World War, and the French, Soviet, and American armies in the Second World War, it's often taken the British Army at least 2 to 3 years to be ready to properly take the field. And we've always had, shall we say, that dubious luxury. But is that a historical assumption which still holds good? And then we come to the rather uncomfortable image of Colonel Blimp. David Lowe's satirical cartoons lampooning the British Army, which really stung the British Army in the early years of the Second World War. Let's be quite honest about this. The British in general, and the British Army in particular, have often been accused of not planning or preparing properly, and instead simply muddling through. Looking at the events of the weekend, it's hard not to see that happening again. So is adaptation in contact simply another word for this very old and discredited concept of muddling through? Or is adaptation and muddling through a virtue rather than a vice? We've already had some discussion about the dilemmas of specialization versus general purpose, or improvisation over standardization. But these are actually arguments which have been going on in military history for a very long time. So having thrown up a few dilemmas, I now want to consider at least one potential sweet spot, which concerns the Alamein campaign of 1942. Now, the British experience in the Desert War of 1940 to 42 was bewildering, to say the least. British forces went from an overwhelming victory over the Italians in Operation Compass in December 1940 to a pretty much wild seesaw of defeat and success over the next 2 years. And the British Eighth Army experienced a wide range of problems over this time, many outside its control, but also others of its own making. Unexpected conditions, rapid expansion of the army, critical shortages of men and material, deficiencies in command, doctrine, organization, and training. The list is pretty much endless. But one of the key features here was that the Eighth Army was almost too busy fighting and dealing with, it has to be said, a formidable opponent, to learn lessons and to take stock. The British Army in the desert became locked into a cycle of failing, adapting, failing again, adapting, and failing again, with no seeming way out of that particular vicious cycle. There's no question the Eighth Army had been forced into a series of tactical expedients, each of which, in their turn, had failed. Now, often when historians look at what happens at El Alamein, they tend to focus on the energizing effect of the new commander, General Bernard Montgomery. But in fact, the Eighth Army had known that things were going wrong. Many officers had very good ideas about what needed to change, but they'd simply not had the time and space in order to do so. The operational breathing space at Alamein in August, September, and October 1942 was of critical importance. And it enabled all of the things that I'm mentioning there: consolidation of doctrine, new techniques, and experimentation so that they knew that things would work. To take just one example, the engineer drill for minefield clearing, very tactical, but absolutely essential to the Army's performance in future battles, indeed throughout the Second World War. And so that breathing space enabled lots of tactical innovation and adaptation, which taken together formed an operational method. Hopefully, an example that might be worth study. So I shall conclude. Adapting in contact is always second best. Adapting in contact is actually very difficult. Recognizing when and how to adapt is a major challenge, and some of these aspects, I think, can help. And when I say that robust doctrine and training and equipment must be avowedly multi-purpose, that's precisely what I mean. Not general purpose, but multi-purpose. And just as importantly, adaptation within the Army cannot be seen and cannot be taken alone. It has to be seen within its wider context, involving diplomatic, political, economic, industrial, and social factors. So, very finally, an acknowledgement that adaptation is likely and may indeed be inevitable does not absolve an armed force of another responsibility: striving to get it right first time. Thank you.
And thank you for staying on time. Antony is going to talk about urban warfare in history. but it's probably as relevant today as we see what's happening in Ramadi, in Fallujah, and possibly in Mosul. Antony?
Warfare generally used to take place in open spaces between identifiable national armies trying to maneuver for advantage. Now, of course, we have to adapt to an age of fragmentation and also face the distinct possibility that the main battlegrounds of the future will be urban, and I'll emphasize the principal lessons in turn. During the Napoleonic Wars, land operations extended from Portugal to Russia, yet very few towns were besieged and stormed. Generals were afraid of losing men through desertion, often as larger drain on manpower in those days as disease, and they were well aware of the dangers of discipline collapsing as soon as alcohol was found, as in Badajoz. But the key reason for avoiding urban warfare was that the military training and the weapons of the day were totally unsuited. In Napoleonic times, most conscripts, or disposable sons, to use Edward Luttwak's phrase, had hardly seen a big city. But by the First World War, a century later, internal migration had swollen the capitals of Europe. So cities now provided a large share of the manpower. But once again, there was very little urban combat. In the early stages of the Second World War, Warsaw and Rotterdam were bombed savagely. But in the Western European theatre, towns were abandoned to the enemy. So when, on the 11th of June 1940, Winston Churchill urged the French General Staff to defend Paris with house-to-house fighting, his idea was greeted with horror. Marshal Pétain, who had just returned from being ambassador to General Franco in Spain, no doubt shuddered at the thought of street fighting. This was revolutionary warfare, and it handed power to industrial workers, as the Spanish anarchist defeat of the generals rising in Barcelona in July 1936 had shown. Pétain's reactionary instincts were right about one aspect, however. So lesson one, generals lose control of events far more rapidly in an urban setting than in the open. The total warfare on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945 was the culmination of the ideological process which accelerated during the 1930s, mass militarization combined with mass indoctrination. And the Battle of Stalingrad from late August 1942 until the 1st of February 1943 became the great example of pitiless city fighting. The conquest of Stalingrad was to be an ersatz victory for Hitler to cover the Wehrmacht's failure to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. And yet, apart from street battles in Voronezh shortly before, Hitler had so far done his utmost to keep his troops out of defended cities. Hitler targeted Stalingrad because it bore Stalin's name, and Stalin felt equally strongly that the city with his name must not fall. In fact, Lavrenti Beria, his chief of police, described it as a battle of rams. So, lesson two, cities imbued with a symbolic resonance for propaganda reasons become dangerously obsessive objectives for both political leaders and the media. General Chuikov, the Soviet commander, ordered his men to keep their defensive positions almost within a grenade throw of the Germans. This made it hard for the Luftwaffe to attack the Red Army without also hitting their own men. So, lesson three, in urban warfare, it is the defender who usually manages to determine the tactics. The great mistake by the German High Command was to carpet bomb the city as Paulus's Sixth Army approached. The ruins provided the perfect killing ground, with anti-tank mines concealed in rubble, anti-tank guns hidden in battered buildings, and storm groups ready to attack out of ruins, cellars, and even sewers. Stalingrad represented a new form of warfare concentrated in the ruins of civilian life. German infantrymen found the close-quarter combat disorientating because it broke conventional military boundaries and dimensions. Tall buildings could be like a layered cake, as one eyewitness put it, with Germans on the top floor, Russians beneath them, and more Germans underneath. Often, an enemy was unrecognizable, with every uniform impregnated with the same dun-colored dust from pulverized brick and masonry. The close-quarter combat in ruined buildings, cellars, and sewers was soon dubbed Rattenkrieg by German soldiers. It possessed a savage intimacy which horrified their generals. They rapidly discovered that Hitler's decision to assault Stalingrad had deprived them of their great advantage in mobility. It reduced them to the techniques of the First World War, even though their own military theorists had argued that trench warfare had been an aberration in the art of war. Paulus's Sixth Army even had to respond to Soviet tactics by reinventing the storm wedges introduced in January 1918. So, lesson 4, the attacker is not only likely to lose control over events, but also his advantages in superior weaponry, mobility, and training. The US Army experienced urban warfare for the first time in Aachen in October 1944. Its attack began with 2 battalions from the 1st Division coming from the north and the northeast, a job that should have been done by 2 regiments, as one of their officers complained with justification. Lesson 5, fighting in built-up areas always consumes far more troops than the planners imagine. Extra men were needed to make sure that the enemy did not slip between adjacent companies to attack from the flank or the rear. Street fighting, an American officer reported, is a slow, tedious business which requires much physical exertion and time. House clearing, GIs were told, meant firing constantly at every window until they were inside the house. Then, with 1 man ready with a grenade in his hand and 2 others covering him, they would go from room to room. They carried armor-piercing rounds to shoot up through the ceiling or down through the floor. They dashed to the top of the house and worked their way down, forcing the Germans into the cellar to be dealt with there by fragmentation and white phosphorus grenades or blasts from a flamethrower. Bazookas, or explosive charges, were used to smash through walls from house to house, an activity which became known as mouse-holing. It was safer to blast through a wall, which would shock anyone in the room beyond, rather than enter through the door. But heavy artillery at close range proved the most cost-effective, if not the most destructive, means of advance. The Americans in Aachen used 155mm self-propelled long toms at ranges as close as 150 meters. The Red Army soon learned the same lesson. In April 1945, 2.5 years after Stalingrad, Marshal Zhukov, goaded by Stalin, was desperate to advance rapidly into Berlin. This prompted him to send his 2 Guards tank armies straight into the city, with tanks at first driving in a line up the middle of the road. But more and more, they relied on heavy guns, especially 152mm and 203mm howitzers, to blast barricades and buildings over open sites. The 3rd Shock Army also used their anti-aircraft guns constantly against rooftops. The roles, of course, were completely reversed this time, with the Red Army as the attacker, enjoying a huge superiority in armor and air power, and the Wehrmacht as the defender and ambusher. With 7 Soviet armies fighting inwards towards the center of the Nazi capital, all of them desperate to win the glory of reaching the Reichstag first, it was hardly surprising that casualties from friendly fire mounted alarmingly. I suspect, but cannot possibly prove, that the Red Army lost almost as many troops from its own ordnance in Berlin as from enemy fire. Lesson 6 is self-evident. Fighting in built-up areas greatly increases the danger of blue-on-blue casualties. Berlin was the last great battle in Europe fought between vast conscripted forces. But the age of the nation in arms did not entirely come to an end even after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. In this very, very brief survey of urban warfare, let's fast forward to Baghdad in 2003. US Army tactics in the assault on the Iraqi capital were flexible and extremely effective. They were, of course, aided by Saddam Hussein's vanity in bulldozing huge triumphal avenues, which allowed the chance of rapid armored thrusts into the city. All the pessimistic media predictions of a Stalingrad sur Tigris collapsed as rapidly as the Ba'athist regime itself. Paradoxes abound when it comes to urban warfare. The aerial destruction of Stalingrad turned the city into an ideal killing zone for the Red Army to ambush the Wehrmacht. But the comparative preservation of Baghdad in 2003 for both humanitarian reasons and, let's face it, media considerations, maintained a far better hiding place for resistance groups later. The coalition's overwhelming success was an anachronism, not in the way that it was fought, but in the fact that in the new world of warfare, conventional military victory is no longer guaranteed to achieve peace. The coalition had been fighting one of the last conscript armies. The present and the future, in the form of urban terrorism, simply waited in the wings. Many of the terrorists came from the ranks of the Iraqi army, which had been so thoughtlessly disbanded. Political leaders also ignored another major change. Guerrilla or partisan warfare always used to be carried out in mountain ranges, forests, or marshes. But now, Lesson 7, both the key targets and the cover to prepare insurgent operations lie in the built-up areas which house the bulk of the population. It's the logical development of the Maoist theory of moving around among the civilian population like fishes in water. The new normal, as the Pentagon likes to call it, means that there are already 24 megacities worldwide. Rapid urbanization will ensure that there will soon be far more. These cities are not easy to move through or to contain, as those troops who fought in conurbations during the Al-Qaeda Sunni insurgency know only too well. Cities can swallow units and enemies are hard to distinguish. It is General Krulak's three-block war writ large, with a bit of the Corporal's War from Northern Ireland. Brigadier General Julian Orford, head of the US Marine Corps Warfighting Laboratory, recently warned that land forces will soon find themselves locked in fights within those dense urban environments where skyscrapers tower over enormous shanty towns. Orford's task is to predict where the Marine Corps will fight in the future, write concepts, and then wargame those concepts in order to feed science and technology development. I quote, "We are going to have these megacities that are ringed with these shanty towns, and we are going to fight there because it will be the people who are uneducated, unemployed, the young men who are not married, and they are mad about their lot in life." End of quote. It is certainly true that demographics and migration should never be overlooked. The powder keg of resentment is much more likely to be in the city rather than in the countryside. Marine Corps Commandant Robert Neller added that it was not easy to build something that would simulate one of these megacities, and the best way to train for this future battlefield, he argued, is through augmented virtual reality. But in contrast to, say, Aachen, where German troops at least wore uniform, it is almost impossible to distinguish between civilian and jihadist. A few might even wear a burqa to conceal suicide bombs. So identification of the enemy is a desperate challenge. Can we hope for longer range and narrow focus metal and explosive detectors in the near future? So lesson 8, apart from training, advanced technology offers the only hope of reducing casualties. The threat of IEDs are, of course, uppermost in almost everyone's minds. As one Washington think tank observed, I quote, "Every area reclaimed from ISIS is to be found liberally seeded with crude roadside IEDs and booby traps. This not only slows the rate of advance for Iraqi security forces and Kurdish Peshmerga and prevents useful momentum from building, but it increases casualties, contributes to the exhaustion of forces, prevents resettlement of displaced populations, and sometimes prompts ethno-sectarian retaliation by Shia troops against local Sunnis." End of quote. In fact, as recent battles in Ramada and Fallujah underline, it really is the defender who has the advantage. Combined arms breaching with combat engineers using armored bulldozers proved to be absolutely essential. What will be far more difficult is dealing with IEDs in the tunnel networks which Daesh fighters dig to avoid air attack, as those under Ramadi and elsewhere indicated. On the other hand, the high-tech possibilities are almost endless, such as mini-drones for reconnaissance in built-up areas. Could we also envisage small sniffer drones to identify IEDs and even explode them? But as a research group recently warned, drones are a game changer in the wrong hands. Only one thing is certain. Urban warfare is going to become very expensive in treasure if we hope to reduce the cost in blood. And as the fight against Daesh in Syria and Iraq indicates, the principal battlegrounds of the future are less likely to be in open terrain. They are much more likely to be in towns and cities. Thank you very much.
General Yakovleff will come to give his remarks. He has long experience in NATO, having served as SACEUR's representative to NATO and then in Brunsum, and of course now as Vice Chief of Staff. General, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have two news, one bad, one good. The bad news is the French are back. The good news is the French do not use PowerPoint. But I'm being disingenuous there because there was a great pictures here. So at long last, I've made it. I've made it to RUSI. For years, I heard of this place. Sometimes I was almost on the list, never made it, and at long last, as I said, I made it. And I will make a lasting impression which guarantees I will never come back. So, adaptation. My pitch is, of course, we need to adapt the challenges, how to, and so on. I'm not sure we realize the magnitude of the challenge. And I hope I am wrong in what I'm going to say. It's a bit of a paradox to come and speak great truths and hope to be proven wrong. Desperately hope to be proven wrong. I believe the controlling idea, to go up front, is that our Western military art has established our superiority for about 6 centuries. We may discuss with historians. I'm not a historian. But I think that age is coming to an end. We are reaching the end of Western military superiority. Like the Roman legion eventually faded, like the Mongol art of war, which dominated for 6 centuries, faded, I think we are reaching the end of Western military superiority. And therefore, the challenge is not adaptation, it's mutation. And the world that we're looking at may change within the next generation. And as I said, I hope I'm wrong. So what am I talking about? In history, we have long ages of military superiority, of one way of war over the others. As I mentioned, the Roman legion, the Mongols. We have achieved, over about 6 centuries, tactical overmatch. Basically, there is no one out of the Western military school of war who defeated us, or else they needed overwhelming numerical superiority and some specific circumstances like Ishondwana, Khyber Pass, or whatever. Otherwise, basically, no one ever defeated a platoon, a battalion of the Western countries. This was also linked with operational art, and I'm very glad you mentioned maritime superiority. The idea that, well, if you fail the first time, you can retrieve what remains and come back another day. Operational art, superiority in the maritime, and then the air domains and the electromagnetic domain have meant that we could choose our wars, put an end to them if we wanted. I'm talking of opponents who are not the Western military school. And then we had a grand strategy, very offensive grand strategy. I mean, the Western world decided to conquer the planet. And our military superiority has created the world as we know it. The Westphalian notion of the nation state is a true Western concept. It has become the unit of count in international affairs. Now, it may be coming to an end, but currently, we are still based on nation states. The UN is a Western world concept. The maps of the world today, all the lines on the maps, they relate to the days when we were conquering areas and asserting power. All our institutions today are a result of our Western art of war superiority. The UN, I mentioned, the World Bank and all that kind of stuff. All these international institutions are outcomes of our Western military superiority. What made it? Well, technology for one part. We developed most of the weapons that give us our superiority today. Okay. Then we had an intellectual revival. It's fascinating to read from some of you how we reinvented the Legion art of war, how the Swiss reinvented the battalion, how later we invented, the French, the divisional concept, and then you had corps, army groups, and all the attending, the equivalents in the maritime and air domains. One of the factors of our military superiority was intense competition at home. The Western world, we were always at each other's throats. And that meant that we had a kind of European League championship. So it was a war of equals. So there was the edge, ebb and flow of war, which meant that when we met our opponents, Cusco, Pizarro, or when the conquerors of India, or America, by the way, we had such a degree of superiority. It's just like, Major League or the German team today going to meet, well, I prefer not to insult anyone, but, going to meet another, lesser league team. Competition at home made us unbeatable elsewhere. For example, our ships, the Western art of shipbuilding was not necessarily superior to that of the Koreans in the 14th century. But then the Royal Navy had to fight against the Spaniards, the Dutch, the French. As a result of that competition, it was unbeatable by anyone else out of the Western world. If you wanted a serious opponent, you had to choose your neighbor. Otherwise, you just swap them. Another factor is demography. In the 19th century, what we would call the Western world today, Europe, America, Australia, New Zealand, South America, represented possibly more than 30% of world population. Currently, Europe is less than 8% and decreasing. So there is virtue in having large numbers. And the numbers are not on our side anymore, and not for a long time, presumably. And also, we had an entrepreneurial spirit. All our conquerors, Pizarro, I suppose Stanley, the few French lieutenants and captains who went to places in Africa, they had a spirit, what we would call today an entrepreneurial spirit. These guys were bandits with very little control from the capital. They assumed, they dared to a degree that was unbelievable today. They had a degree of initiative, or they took it, and they did much more than had been ordered. They were free thinkers in their own ways. And we generally there was Western expansionism. Do we call it a strategy? I'm not sure. But there was, America going after its frontier, the frontier spirit, the grab of Africa, the grab of Asia, and all that. There was a general tendency of all our nations in Europe of just expanding. I'm not sure it was a strategy, but the outcome looks like strategy. So where are we today? Well, technology. It can be imitated, and quite often those who imitate end up doing better. And we all remember how Sony and so on, the Japanese, wiped out the Americans from the market for hi-fi. Now America came back with the iPad, okay. But, technology, the technological edge, how sure are we that we will have the silver bullet next time? I'm not sure. I suspect we are less sure every day. Intellectually, we developed concepts, operational art, and so on. Well, it may be that new concepts are being developed. We talk a lot about hybrid warfare and so on. It's not necessarily new. It's another way of waging war with which we feel very uncomfortable. When it's imposed on us, I mean, we had that 20 years ago. When there was still a Soviet Union, they were undermining the Western world, abetting a number of communist parties, creating what Lenin called the useful idiots, like Yves Montand, who would go around extolling the virtues of the Soviet Union. They were undermining our society. Eventually, they failed. But when we think of it, the Soviet Union of the time was a third world country that made the whole world believe it was the equivalent of America, a peer for America, the greatest power in history on every measure of count. These guys made us believe that for 50 years. Ultimately, the lie was exposed and it crashed. But I admire the operational art and the spiritual dominance that made the whole world fear them to the degree we feared them. Now, they had true factors to be feared. I mean, nuclear power, large army, and so on. But it was mostly their societal model that impressed us. That can be recreated, or possibly is. Demography I mentioned, and the entrepreneurial spirit, that's our main issue today. Who would be the lieutenants of today to conquer the world? No one would let that happen. If only because C2 has caught up on them. All those guys who conquered large spaces in Africa or in America were not tethered to their country. They didn't fight no one could call them at midnight to say, stop your nonsense. And they were also of a culture where even telling them stop your nonsense wouldn't go that far, which is not necessarily the culture we're developing in our own people today. Currently, I see, for example, our obsession with force protection as an inherent disadvantage. If we don't agree to losses, then we go nowhere. And then we have an issue with strategy. In the West, today, our strategy is purely defensive. It is protection that we hear about. Our duty is to protect, which is fine, okay, but it's inherently defensive. And if you are only defending, you are doomed to fail. Byzantium, Constantinople, was attacked a number of times. It only took one time to be conquered for it to be over. Mehmet, when he conquered Constantinople, if he had failed, he would have come back 4 years later, or his son. If your strategy is purely defensive, as is ours today, then we are bound to fail, almost by definition, by concept. So, if there is a way out of this quandary, I'd like to say I know what the new model of war will be, the new one for the next 6 centuries. I don't have that perception. I apologize for that. Don't have that degree of imagination. I just believe our model currently is failing, is massively failing. Now, we may adapt. Adaptation, robotization of war, for example, may give us an extra breath, an extra time, possibly to find the new model. But robots can be copied, replicated. New models, better concepts to use robots, for example, can be developed, not necessarily by us. So we have a massive problem. And I believe the main problem is a lack of strategy. Ultimately, we are going to develop the tools we can for our political masters. But if the strategy is an absence of strategy, purely defensive, not controlling our approaches, not trying to impose our way, put an end to chaos in Syria, for example, if our strategy is just to wait for the refugees, then we are doomed to fail. Now, talking of demographics.
Take about 2 minutes because we're running over.
Okay, right, so I've run over. So, initiative, flexibility, austerity, fortitude in the long haul. but I'm not sure it will be enough. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sure somebody from the audience is going to ask about Vietnam and Afghanistan in terms of your model. Brigadier Finkel is going to talk about lessons that the Israelis have learned.
The bad news is that my English is the worst you've heard today. The good news is that I've got a very elaborated presentation that will cover on this. What I will present here is based on a combination of a theory that put what I called flexibility as the main answer to future battlefield uncertainties, and specifically to doctrinal and technological surprises, and my personal experience in almost a decade of implementing this theory in the IDF. The basic claim is that intelligence and anticipation processes have their peacetime limits, and therefore the real solution lies not in making them better, but in battlefield adaptation that have to be built in peacetime with 4 layers or components that you can see on the left side, and I will emphasize the 3 underlined. In the last decade, as you may know, the IDF fought in Second Lebanon War, 3 successive operations in Gaza. 2 of them involved 2 to 3 army divisions, hundreds of incidents in the Golan Heights, Israeli-Lebanese border, the West Bank, Israeli-Egyptian border, many of them including unexpected scenarios and surprises to IDF forces. This drove the IDF to change, but also the other side, mainly Hamas and Hezbollah, to adapt as well. One example, very relevant to the IDF forces and maybe to British land forces, is the underground terrain warfare, which is a kind of accelerated arms race since the Second Lebanon War, and there are many other examples like rockets and counter-rocket measures, anti-tank missiles and countermeasures and more. The learning contest drove a series of changes in organization, doctrine, training, and technology, which I will not elaborate on, but I will emphasize the changing processes that were developed during the last years, basically the mechanisms that developed during the last decade in order to enhance the IDF capability to learn, adapt, and change in a way that will keep it relevant with solution to the problem of the ever-changing challenges. And that include, and I will elaborate on the 4 first, accelerating the strategic and operational learning processes, the educational effort, training scenarios, and our wartime lesson learned system, beside the coin one that we have for what we are doing for routine security missions, something that is operated only in operations in Gaza or in Lebanon. The first one is, the title is missing here. It's the Dado Center mission, which you can read what we are doing. Basically, the IDF transformed this center, which I'm the head of, from a kind of think tank that gives advices to a machine that aid the regional commanders, the GHQ branches in their processes. What we are doing is Dado Center provides a combination of a well-founded in IDF eyes learning theory for complex and dynamic environments, methodological experts that accompany the leaders, tailor-made research for the specific problems that are the focus of the learning processes, and tailor-made war games. You can see on the left side, we also lead specific courses on that issue. Basically, it's courses on learning, how to learn, and I will elaborate more on the education. And the demand in the IDF for, not only in the IDF, but in other security services in Israel for those kind of processes is growing all the time. So we are involved in more and more processes, and we are having more and more courses on how we learn. Education, of course, is the foundation of almost everything. Here I will focus on both ends of the chain of command. And at the platoon level, at the top, the Black Swan series challenges the cadet with extreme uncertainty up to a need to develop on-the-spot TTPs to think that he was not taught for. And, you know, cadets in the IDF officers are about 19 years old, 19 and a half. Another development is new, that beginning as a pilot this summer, a tactical simulation developed specifically to focus on the cadet's ability to identify changes in the simulated battlefield and respond to them effectively. It combines both the cognitive development of the cadet and an assessment of his adaptation skill. And the idea is at the end of the pilot, the idea is that to give marks on adaptation according to the results of the simulation. This simulation was adopted practically last week by the Command and Staff College as well. At the top of the chain, the bottom of the slide, you see new courses that I may call them learning courses. They are not focused on how to fight, they are focused on how to learn and change. Kind of transformation or adaptation courses. Brigadier General's course is about 30 days spread along the year, 3 days per month. The NDC changed, National Defense College have changed and focused more on how to teach how to learn. And the colonel's course, lieutenant colonel's course, and the force design colonel's workshop is done in Dado Center. There are 10 days of intensive how to learn courses. So this is concerning the education effort. No, the IDF culture is if you're familiar with, is a bottom-up culture. First you do, and then you are conceptualizing what you've done. What I needed to do is to conceptualize this into, you know, it is an educational effort. We didn't call this way. We just went from, okay, adding another course, changing this. But basically, it's a real change. Training is more essential than ever for the IDF when on one hand you are occupied with routine security missions along the Israeli borders in the West Bank, and that missions deteriorate mission command, and on the other hand you have to prepare for full-scale war. Here you can see how the IDF tries to purposely overemphasize uncertainty in exercises at all levels, and commanders compete each other in making life hard for their subordinates in imaginative ways. And there is an annual prize in the Ground Forces Command for designing those imaginative trainings. The basic notion of the need to be challenged both cognitively and mentally goes up to the most senior level. As you can see, the commander of the IDF, who is mistakenly called the chief of staff, is truly the commander, is fully challenged in scenarios that aimed to make him, cognitively speaking, sweat. He's not, you know, he doesn't know everything. He knows that he is going to be surprised. He's fully prepare himself for that. Better understanding of the complex reality and challenging current concepts is done also through strategic and operational level war games, which occurred more than before, most of them done in Dado Center. And the education and training are all based on basic culture that practically prefers learning the hard way over the good feeling of the trainee, which is usually based on winning. And all measures are employed, as I specify here. You are a brigade commander. The division commander is preparing your brigade exercise. You know that he is talking with your battalion commanders, that in certain points they are going to fail in their mission, so he will fail as a brigade commander, and he will force to think about things that the division commanders want him to do. So this is part, everybody knows that this is a basic part of any exercise. And that's the basic, that's the essence of the educational story and training effort. The fourth element is what I called here if you can see on the Command and Staff College, learning while fighting is elaborated here. We've got a kind of accelerated learning process for wartime, which was operated in 2008. You can see in the operations in Gaza. The Ground Forces Lesson Learning Center deploys and works in a 24 hours learning cycle. Its mission, and I was the head of this organization in CAST-led. The mission is to provide within 24 hours new lesson learned to the forces. There are learning events as part of the HQ wartime daily routine. Learning officers, that their mission is to prepare the learning event. And we are practicing this. In division exercise, this is part of the basic capabilities that the division have to learn. So from one side, let's say the regional commander is putting from one side, from bottom up, all kinds of changes, surprises, and watch if the division headquarters understand the changes in the battlefield. And this is also practice, this real-time learning and lesson learned is practiced in the Command and Staff College. They are practicing, they are putting part of the cadets or the students are the learning officer, they are preparing this and practicing. And the last slide is my proposal for the British Army. Basically, adaptive mind is a capability. You've got, it's not something that, on the way will take a shape. You've got machines, you've got military knowledge, and you've got adaptation or adaptiveness. I don't know if there's a word such as adaptiveness in English. So the commanders should be, first of all, selected for the skill. You should find the guys that, are convenient with change, educated, and practically what I said before is that we are giving more learning capabilities and less knowledge, and trained. Learning events as part of battle procedures, personnel, all the system that I presented. And when you are deployed and you don't know where you are going to deploy, my takeaway is that you employ intensive learning effort, like kind of the first engagement as a controlled experiment. Deployed, with the first brigade, the lesson learned that goes to the field with everything that he needs in order to learn from the first battle and make the second one with the massive force or decisive force much better. Thank you.